I am so excited that the person bringing us home is one of my closest friends, one of my closest colleagues, a person who has known me for longer than I can actually remember now. And we have had massive fun together. Harry has been, innovation games facilitator, business strategist, business leader. He is an expert on the concept of prioritization, which sounds weird, but it's such a hard task that to do it well is really not easy. He has also has a big heart, so he works in service of things that are larger than himself. And that's a little bit about what he's going to talk about right now. And Harry, I wish I had more eloquent ways to describe, but feelings get in the way of this one. So I'm so glad you're here. And I'm so thankful that you're going to be sharing some of your thoughts with us. Take it away.
Yeah, well, first off, really, really happy to be here. Thank you so much for, the invitation, and I love what FirstRoot is doing and what you're bringing to the world through FirstRoot. And, it's so funny when you look back, the path always looks so obvious when you look backwards. But, if you could look forwards and try to chart it, strategy is easy when you look backwards. But at any rate, thank you all for being here. I'll try to keep this as coherent as possible. I spent a long time over the last couple of days trying to think through how to share some thoughts with you about the connection between the ideas here and Luke and what it is I'm doing. And of course, I just heard my phone ring, so let me turn that off. I neglected that. I do have a bit of a presentation, and so I want to walk you through some slides. And I'm not a big slide person, so there aren't a ton of them, but I figured it was probably going to be the best way to make sure that that this story was coherent. So let me go ahead and share my slides and share my screen, if I may, and then I'll turn my camera off just so that we're not all distracted with that while I'm doing the slide part of this, and then I'll turn my camera back on when when we get toward the end. That's all right. All right, so can you see the slides? No, I see some nods. Great.
Yes, and it looks kind of cool. But is that a font you created, or did you find that? That looks, it's kind of like Flintstones. I love it.
I actually put a presentation together for my work in prioritization, and the designer that I worked with found the font, and so licensed it for use in stuff like this. And it just looked perfect for our application here. But at any rate, I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about when I was thinking about what FirstRoot was doing, and I realized that it's so important, and brought me all the way back to some of the earliest and happiest parts of my life. And I started thinking about one of my hobbies, and that really brought into focus the fact that what we're doing here is opening the aperture, widening the aperture a little bit. All I have to do is figure out how to, there we go, change the screen. I wanted to tell you just a little bit about how this kind of came into focus, and I want to tell you about the hobby that really speaks to what opening an aperture is, and then introduce you to, if you're not already familiar with, the concept of public-private partnerships and how all this sort of connects. So, I got a phone call about 4 or 5 months ago from a friend of mine who said, "Hey, I'd like to pass your name along to something called the Tech Talent Project, and they're working with the Aspen Tech Policy Hub. Now, the Tech Talent Project is a nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to increasing the ability of the U.S. government to recruit modern technical leaders in order to achieve critical economic, policy, and human outcomes. It was founded in 2017 by former technology leaders from both the Obama and the Trump White House. And what they are, in effect, is like a recruiting agency, but it's a nonprofit that's looking for, sort of people with the right mindset and the right skills and capabilities and the right orientation to be either a presidential appointee or somebody at the senior executive staff level in either the executive branch or one of the major agencies. And what they do is they qualify people and determine sort of whether those people are interested in going through a program that the Aspen Tech Policy Hub are put on, and it's a technical executive leadership initiative. And the Aspen Institute's an international nonprofit organization founded in just about 1950, and they have international partners to promote the creation of a free, just, and equitable society in a nonpartisan and non-ideological setting through seminars, policy programs, conferences, leadership development initiatives, and the like. And so, I sort of passed their vetting and told them I was very interested. At this point in my life, I'm trying to figure out how to scale up my service. I've spent a long time in the private sector in various roles, which I'll tell you a little bit more about. But the gist is, I was, our government, the U.S. government anyway, has really lost a lot of talent over the last 4 years or so, and so they're looking to replenish it with people who are, that are familiar with AI, that are familiar with the cloud, that are familiar with Agile, that they're really trying to get modern technology leaders in place. And so I dropped into a cohort, the winter 21 cohort, and the team was composed of of all senior technology savvy leaders. Some of us were lawyers and some of us were product people, some of us were designers. And the Telly program focuses on preparing leaders to engage effectively with civic challenges, government and organizational dynamics to have policy impact. Mm. And the idea is, through experiential learning with real world problems, that the leaders in this program sharpen their skills to work more effectively with elected officials, civil servants, to mitigate risk and improve outcomes on highly complex technology initiatives and projects. Well, in addition to all the reading, in addition to all the homework and all of the projects, each of us was required to write a real policy memo, a proposal, in effect, to somebody in the executive branch of the federal government. And I'll come back to that in a bit. I wanted to, sort of shine a little bit of light on why me, right? I'm just this random Silicon Valley dude. And I mean, in a nutshell, I work with senior leaders, startup founders, technical visionaries and stuff to help them, at this point, realize their visions and build high-performing teams and zero in on sort of solutions to complex challenges. And I've been a founder CEO, an executive, and a business coach, and a consultant with startups. And, I've worked with companies ranging from, Adobe to Apple to DreamWorks and Google and HP and Microsoft and so on and so forth. As a co-founder of a company back in 1994 called Virtual Vineyards, it was the original wine.com, I designed the first, what turned out now historically to have been the first user-friendly, secure online shopping cart. And this was roughly a year before Amazon opened its doors for business. And I'm now writing a book on prioritization to try to encapsulate some of the insights that I've learned about how it is that individuals, teams, and organizations can become more effective, in both the public and private sector. But I met Luke shortly after leaving DreamWorks Animation, where I ran the web, the intranet team, the web team, and I feel incredibly fortunate to be able to call him a friend and a mentor and a sometimes collaborator as well. But back to the previously scheduled story, this policy memo that I ended up writing, the personal project, we were given strict guidelines as to the structure and the format of this memo, but it was a blank slate in terms of what we wanted to recommend and to whom. It needed to be, directed to the executive level of the US government, which meant either to the president or the vice president or somebody at a very senior level. And I had a thought. So I picked up the phone and I called Luke with an idea. But alas, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So I grew up in Malibu. I was super fortunate to have grown up in a place. I mean, we lived in kind of a track home in Malibu, which is kind of an oxymoron, but northwest of Los Angeles, but it was the heart of the entertainment industry. And as a kid, my main hobby, I liked playing guitar, but my main hobby was taking pictures with my trusty Nikon FE. And today, mostly I use my iPhone, but sometimes I haul out, a digital single lens reflex camera today when I want to have more control over the shutter speed, or I want to open the aperture. And so some of you may be familiar with what an aperture is, but the gist of it is it's a mechanism that controls the amount of light that gets from the outside the camera through the lens to, once upon a time, to film. And more recently, obviously, it goes to a digital sensor. And the idea is that by controlling the amount of light that gets in to either to the film or to the sensor, it gives you more control over what you're focusing on. So you can focus on one subject. It allows a lot of light to come in quickly, so it helps you capture and freeze action. And it also lets you, let a lot of light in when there isn't much light available. And so, whether it's, a portrait or a flower, or whether it's, sports or something that's moving quickly, or whether you're trying to take a picture at night, the idea is that opening the aperture creates an opportunity for us to really focus on things in a new way. So let me switch back to the topic of public-private partnerships, which I mentioned in the very first slide. And the idea is that this policy memo, I was thinking to myself, policy, what is policy? And what would I do if I had a blank sheet of paper and I could direct some instructions to our current administration, because this is the timing of which I went through this program? What would I recommend? And I thought, well, I would love to see if the government can work with a company like FirstRoot to figure out how to scale up this really important educational opportunity for kids and their families. And but I didn't know the first thing about public-private partnerships, frankly. And so, the first thing I had to do is kind of dive into, what are they and why are they important and how do they work? When I first heard about them, I didn't really know what to make of them, because, it's a little bit confusing to think about, okay, a public-private partnership, what is it really? And I've since learned that the idea is relatively simple in its concept and fairly rich and sophisticated in terms of what it can turn out to be. And the best way to think about it is it's a vehicle for collaborative change. And as a vehicle, it's you could think of it as a container, a purpose-built container for getting from one place to another place to connect the power of private with the power of public. And they're typically collaborations between a government agency and some kind of private sector company that can be used to finance and build and operate a project. And they're super common in transportation networks, in parks and convention centers, and schools, and water and electricity. Like, the government and private companies connect and form these partnerships to do things that are very difficult for the government to be successful at quickly, and for the private companies to scale up because of the money that's required and sometimes the support that's needed. So think of this vehicle, if you will, as a formal connection between a public institution and a private interest. And businesses do partnerships all the time, so it's normal, right? It's just a little bit weird to think about a public sector, governmental agency partnering with a private sector company, because they sort of have different focuses, if you will. I hate the word foci. The public sector, whether it's at the federal or the state, at the local level, is really about serving all citizens to the best extent that they can. And the private sector, whether it's a stock for profit kind of corporation, or some kind of benefit corporation, or some kind of nonprofit structure, they're really about figuring out how to deliver products or services or experiences to stakeholders. So they necessarily exclude all citizens, because there's no way to serve everybody well. And so there's simply, it's a collaboration to promote greater investment in areas such as, new technologies or other kinds of approaches that hopefully benefit society as a whole. And, as I mentioned, you find them in, transportation infrastructure, and highways and airports and railroads and bridges and tunnels and water facilities and schools and sports facilities. Why not open the aperture a little bit wider? Why not look at how public-private partnerships can be used to enable something like participatory budgeting in schools? So let's take a little bit of a step back. What is it that the government or the public sector focuses on, right? And governments, they do taxes, right? They do regulation, they do subsidies and grants, they provision services, they structure private rights, they provide frameworks and adjustments for economic activity. They do financing and contracting at very large scale. They enable bureaucratic and political reforms. And perhaps more importantly for our purposes, they are largely responsible for education as well. And the thing is given that, what is it, and how would you compare that to what companies do in the private sector, And okay, companies build things, they provide services, they reallocate resources, they recruit talent, they invent stuff, they execute private rights. And, so businesses are particularly good at innovating in technologies and business models and recruiting and managing talent and taking risks. And the government public sector orientation is particularly good at stabilizing things and figuring out how to plan for and provide vast infrastructure and implementing and adjusting policies to try to move the world, hopefully, in a better direction. And given all of that, the question then becomes, why is it that public-private partnerships are important? And they give us a kind of leverage to enable the rapid commercialization and allow us to deploy and scale up innovations in a way that might be too difficult for a company to do, or might be too risky, or might take too long for the government to do. They put us in a position to use government spending to increase private sector investments. They enable sharing of risks and rewards. And you could think of them as allowing what's a small amount of money for government to provide a disproportionately large effect from the point of view of a private company and the quote unquote customers that company serves. Well, the thing is that requires a set of aligned incentives. And in order for those incentives to be aligned, that both the public sector / government and the private sector / companies have a set of needs and interests and goals. And if they can bring into focus those needs and interests and goals in a way that allows the government to partner with a private company to achieve those things, then we end up in a place that wouldn't be possible otherwise. So the thing is if you can figure out how to structure a partnership to provide advantages to both parties, you end up with the improvements in operational efficiency of providing public services, the kinds of things companies tend to do well and governments tend to take a long time and tend to drag their feet on, but provide the incentives for the private sector to deliver those projects on time and within budget at scale. You create a very interesting set of competitive very interesting set of competitive sort of, I'm searching for a word here.
Options?
Yeah, there you go. Thank you. That allow us to do things that otherwise wouldn't be possible. Sometimes these things wouldn't have even been possible at all, right? And when I think about what it is that FirstRoot is doing, and how participatory budgeting is sort of this seemingly, I think when we look at it in the future, we're going to look back and say it was so obvious, but looking at it going forward, it's like, well, how do we make that happen? Well, if we can figure out how to direct a certain amount of private funding, if you will, to help scale this thing up and do it in a way that allows it to be fair and equitable, we can create a set of new possibilities that create the kind of world that we want to live in and give people more choice by inviting them into a collaborative environment for decision making at all levels. And it brings it's sort of, instead of creating this hard line between, gosh, I grew up and I didn't learn about money, and then I went into the real world and, oh my God, now I have all this debt. Instead of that hard line happening between being a kid and being an adult, being smoothed out so that people have kids have a kind of a felt sense of what it's like to be thinking through and making these decisions and then living with the results. That would be just astonishing. But nothing's perfect. I mean, a public-private partnership isn't necessarily the answer, right? Some people criticize them for blurring the lines between, seemingly legitimate public purposes and private for-profit activity. But the fact is that sometimes a public-private partnership or something like that is the perfect vehicle for figuring out how to scale up. The downsides are, private partners, a company can face special risks in this process, right? Because delivering on time can be really hard at scale. You've got to be good. And sometimes delivering ends up exceeding the cost that people expect, or technical or compliance or security or privacy issues become very challenging to manage. Or sometimes demand is either much smaller or much bigger than we expect. And, private companies have a hard time dealing with this. And then from the other side, right, from the general public's point of view, right, the risks aren't as acute, but some people say that, there's not as much accountability. And, maybe a public-private partnership would create the kind of environment where substandard services can be delivered, or, corners can get cut, or the private company ends up in a privileged position where it can raise rates or do things that are sort of abusive to citizens or captive consumers who may now be locked into a system, which I think is why it's important to structure these things properly. I mean, the struggle to create fair and equitable partnerships is real, but it's definitely doable. So about that policy memo, the thing is, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. The structures exist. The concept of a formal partnership between a private sector company or not-for-profit or public benefit corp and a government agency, this structure has been around a long time. And if we step back and widen our view and open the aperture a little bit, it creates new kinds of opportunities for us to think about financing. So when I wrote this memo to the Secretary of Education, I say I wrote this memo, but actually I had some help, and I have to thank Luke for his incredible insights and contribution to this process, because for me, it was homework for the Aspen Institute, but it was also an opportunity to get something I felt very strongly about in front of what amounts to the highest level of the US government to consider implementing and making change. And I can't, in a memo like this, I can't recommend that the government partner with FirstRoot, but I can suggest that putting a public-private partnership in place to accelerate the adoption of participatory budgeting in public schools nationwide with a company like FirstRoot. Oh, by the way, there's only one of them, it appears, that's well positioned to deliver the curriculum, to do all of the work that's necessary to customize the implementation and to roll out a program like this. That, it may not happen tomorrow, but this idea is now rattling around in front of people who have an opportunity to consider the merits of whether or not this is going to get the kind of attention at the level of priority that's necessary. And when you think about the costs of not doing this, which is how the rest of the memo is framed, the cost of not doing this, not having kids that grow up that have a sense of how to handle money and how money is spent and how it ought to be applied, and don't have a felt sense of civic engagement and don't feel like their votes matter, the costs are huge. So now is the time, I feel, to do this. And look, I'm not an expert in public-private partnerships. I'm not an expert in finance. By all measures, I'm really a qualitative guy, not a quantitative guy. So you don't want me too close to a spreadsheet, especially a complicated one. But the thing is that it's a fractal model, right? It works at the local level. It works at the state level. It works at the federal level. It works in other countries. It's not a US thing only, right? There are pluses and minuses to how you might go about doing this, right? You might, for instance, have the public-private partnership sort of focus on a public bond, like a social impact bond, a traditional bond, and raise money and take that money and make it available to states to give to school districts, to give to schools, to give to classrooms, to have kids manage how that money ought to get spent. Or alternatively, there are private activity bonds. It's more of a corporate bond, a private bond. And the government in that case really has a hand in kind of branding and sponsoring it, but not taking the same kind of risk. And while it may be a little bit early for all of this, my dear friend and investor, John Long from Trellis Partners, once reminded me that being too early is indistinguishable from being wrong. And I don't know where he got that. I'm sure it's famous, right? But being too early is indistinguishable from being wrong. But sometimes being early is just that, right? A cigar is just a cigar. It's just a beginning. It's an early beginning. And I feel like that's where FirstRoot is. This is the first conference. I remember the first Linux conference, and it was small. I remember, I've been around the Silicon Valley block for a while. I've been to a number of first conferences, and this is a first conference. We're at an early beginning. The timing is right for participatory budgeting for so many different reasons, not the least of which is, the forced choice ranked voting, I never remember how to quite call it, is sort of starting to take on. People are thinking about alternative, the sort of positive alternative mechanisms for implementing voting. And that's happening in New York, right? Where participatory budgeting has basically got a good housekeeping seal of approval and is in some cases being mandated. And this policy memo picks up and says, let's just take that idea and figure out how to start replicating it with other states and other locales and other school districts that are motivated to recognize the power and impact of this kind of approach. So, back to when you look behind you, it all seems obvious, and you look in front of you, it's not so clear. If other companies were doing this right now, it would be obvious, but it's not obvious because FirstRoot is in that leading position, and there will come other companies and people will start lining up, and over time it will become more obvious that this is an important path forward, but somebody's got to go first. And that's the position that FirstRoot is in. That's the position that Luke is leading from. And that's why I felt that it was worth bringing that into focus and recommending to the highest levels of the US government that we figure out how to create a partnership that brings what amounts to the small amount of money from the public sector for the use and management of sort of the states and school districts, but through the container of a public-private partnership and the structures that allow the implementation of participatory budgeting. And so I think about this, all the way back to my hobby as a photographer. I think about this as like opening the aperture, like financial literacy and civic engagement. It doesn't matter what your political leaning happens to be, because fundamentally this is about effective prioritization and use of public money, giving kids the tools they need to become responsible participants in their lives and in society at large. And the time's now. There's a recipe for scale, right? Why not rapidly scale what's already proven to work? Why not leverage public funds and private innovation and investment for the public good? Why not provide all the necessary components to implement PB in schools? Why not do it in a way that's faster and less expensive to taxpayers than it would be if the government tried to implement this themselves? There's no possible way the federal government and states can move as quickly as a highly innovative, very focused machine that's running a highly tuned agile practice. If this is done properly, it gives states and the local educational authorities ultimate control over the curriculum and the implementation, but it allows the spread of the PB idea quickly. So, if we let a company like FirstRoot with purpose-built software and a customizable curriculum, the capability and documentation and training and support wrapped in the benefits of a benefit corporation, scale up with the power and seal of approval and program seed money from the public, I figure the federal government can motivate the states can motivate the districts can motivate the schools. Let's open the aperture and let some more light in. Now's the time, but change takes time.
Oh man, you're taking away the best pictures because you have great pictures. That one of the kids is hilarious.
Yeah, let me, there we go.
It's super cute, man.
I'm happy to take questions. I'm not sure what I might have left out. That's about really about all I have to say about that at this point.
Well, can I just jump? Do you mind my jumping in, Luke?
Yes, please.
The public-private, the concept of a public-private collaboration, partnership in whatever form, but public and private, seemed like an obvious solution to so many things when I came into education as a second career in my 40s. And there just was no mindset on the educational side for things like that. I was fortunate enough to be able to work and seek out teaching arrangements where the administrators agreed with my concept that we need to look beyond. But it was pretty rare. Now, I think where I live in Northern California, it can be a little parochial. I think there are a lot of other areas in big cities, small towns, whatnot, that they're more open-minded. But anyway, I think public-private partnerships are the way that I think that schools need to move forward. I think schools, I think the establishment and the way that schools, particularly in California, have been frankly controlled, probably not the right word, but frankly controlled by collective bargaining agreements and whatnot, really stymied a lot of progress. And in my opinion, again, this is my opinion, but it's been my experience as well. And I think, but now we've come through an extraordinary year and a half of school. And I think it's a really important time to be bold.
I hear you. And I think when I first heard about public-private partnerships, the public part eclipsed the private part. And I think opening the aperture a little bit allows us to say maybe the public part needs to be structured in such a way that it's really helping to direct cash to the right place. And maybe the sort of the broad structures for fairness and equitability to ensure that things are implemented well, but not have that capital P public on the implementation side.
Well, that would be tough, but doable. I think it's doable. And like I said, I think this last year has really, it's got a lot of educators, a lot of administrators, superintendents, school boards having to regroup on a lot of different fronts. And so it's just ripe, I think, with opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the opportunity is there, and it may very well not be an immediate tomorrow thing. It may mean that we need to figure out what the structure of that private public partnership would look like in a way that would be more acceptable than perhaps it's been in the past.
Yeah.
But I do think it the notion of a partnership between any entity and just looking at how do you balance the needs and interests and goals of each of those entities in a way that allows the citizens to be served, to get what's needed. And it isn't necessarily going to be easy or straightforward, but I agree with you. I think we have a moment.
Mm-hmm. I think we do.
Well, I hope so. I mean, part of the strategy is to live to fight another day, right? Acquire, and I hope the dev team. I know you've been really brilliant at sticking with us. Danny and Eduardo and Federico and Jessica and Luis. I mean, it's been amazing that you've been working on this so hard with all of us. But notice what he said, right? He's, where we have an advantage is in agile practices. And when we write clean code, when we build our CI/CD pipeline, when we have our testing infrastructure, when we know what our stress response curve is, when we have understanding of compliance with COPA, with compliance with FERPA, with compliance with state standards for financial literacy, and in the absence of a state standard of financial literacy, the Jumpstart standards. When we kind of like lay the foundation, part of it, and my team has heard me say this, Harry, you can imagine this. Team, what Harry didn't also mention is he's an expert in user experience and usability. And so when I say we want to design the hit the easy button, Harry is one of the few people who can actually design easy buttons. And understanding, the human experience, the not the UI, the visual beauty, but the deeper UX. What is that customer and user experience that guides the students through this and supports teachers so thoroughly that a teacher who wants to try this out just goes to our website. He or she says, I'd like to do participatory budgeting, and I'm fully supported with the right video. I have the next question I have is integrated into the app. The documentation isn't separate, but that's one of our strategies right now, is to continue to look at the notion of true self-service. The control panels exist. Harry, we're starting to talk about control panels for our administrative functionality. The school district, the school system. Earlier today, Tia Crum was talking about Chicago Public Schools. Just to put it out there, team, 340,000 kids in the Chicago Public School. And so imagine Tia came up to us and said, we've been trialing your software in these 5 schools. We're ready to go. Well, they're not going to have 340,000 user IDs and passwords. They're just going to say, connect us up to your SSO. The Madison School District, right, who we're talking to, 27,000 kids in Madison, Wisconsin, right? 5 high schools, 12 middle schools, 32 elementary schools. All of them right on the edge of this public-private partnership. Schools wondering what to do with some of the funding that exists now, ESSER funding. Schools desperately trying to figure out how to recover from the learning loss. So this notion of being prepared. I'm going to go into one sports analogy, and then maybe we'll bring it home. The second string athlete who's on the pro team, who's instantly ready to go into the game, right? And especially in the NBA, you see that, right? They have an award called the Sixth Man Award, right? Who's the person that's not the starter, but it's actually considered to be like the 6th person on the team. They're so critical coming off the bench because you can only have 5 people on the court. And you'll find that the teams that win the championship have that 6th or 7th person on the bench ready to go. So that's sometimes how I think about us, is when our government, and not just our government, the US, but when governments around the world who are all facing these same problems of inequity, who are all facing these problems of need for greater financial literacy. This is not a US problem. And, water rights in the Middle East are, equivalent to oil rights in America, right? When they need to collaborate, we can be ready to support them. So this notion of public-private partnerships in thinking about these things as Harry does, which is different, right? Harry thinks differently. It's really exciting. So I think that may be the end of the FirstRoot Global Conference on participatory budgeting in schools, with a few extra, topics thrown in just for fun. I am so happy that we did this. I am so thankful to Rebecca for, you have no idea how much work she did and how wonderful and how happy I am. Rebecca, you're one of those people who I'm actually trying to find ways to work with you over the years. And it's just like, oh, okay, great. I get to work with Rebecca. Awesome. I feel safe. I feel comfortable. I know I'm going to be handled in a way
that is too kind.
Is needed to be, right? And so, Rebecca Gallagher, for you, it's very nice to make a new connection and a new friend, and this world that's opening up to us. We're very excited. Team, how you feeling? I know you gotta be tired. I got, tomorrow at stand up, we're gonna say, what'd you do yesterday? And you're gonna be like, I don't remember. I listened to a lot of Zoom calls. How you doing, team?
Tired, but happy, very happy and excited after a lot of very good talks. Yeah.
Yeah, same here. As I often tell you, Luke, every day learning something new, but this last 24 hours was something exceptional. So meeting great people, learning from experts, and yeah, super excited.
I think
Yeah,
overwhelming. Sorry.
Go ahead, yes. Go ahead, yes. Go ahead, yes.
I think overwhelming with all the information. Most of the information I didn't know anything about that. I need just sometimes stop in the middle of the thing of the meetings and say what is going on here. I need to think about more and maybe investigate more. But some others were very, very, very useful, not just for the information about the PV, for all the mathematicals and financials and all that kind of thing. And I think for the emotional too, one of the last one for the health was very interesting. And I think all the conference, all the conversation was very, very informative. I'm very grateful for hear all of the conference.
Yeah, same for me. I get to share what Fede mentioned. I think every day during this last year with FirstRoot is a new learning. In these last 24 hours, there was a lot of that. And as Jessica mentioned, we got a lot of information from different like topics, and those topics we are trying to cover as FirstRoot: financial, civics, and so on. So that's really great. As all the team mentioned, we got a lot of from our side, not just as developers, but all the complementary information. Some research to do to understand better how the system works actually behind the scenes. So yeah, it was really great, and it's really inspiring seeing all on the call, and actually you, Luke, Clint, and all the team behind of the organization of the event to stay through all the conferences. So that's huge, and congratulations to all. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you to everybody. I'm like blown away by the presenters, by the speakers.